Welcome to Recollections, the Middle Tennessee Voices of Their Time series, a look at the past through the experiences of Middle Tennesseans. I'm Bob Bullen of Middle Tennessee State University, visiting with Mrs. Nancy Anderson in Bell Buckle, Tennessee. I'm at the entrance to her home, and in just a moment I'm going in and talk with Mrs. Anderson about her experiences in Hollywood as a celebrity interviewer. She was an outstanding newspaper journalist, was a graduate of the prestigious Missouri Journalism School, and during her years in California brought great joy and pleasure to many TV and movie fans all across the country with her celebrity interviews. She knew all of the greats, starting with Francis X. Bushman in the silent era up to Elvis Presley, Doris Day, Rock Hudson, John Wayne, and Barbara Stanwyck in the modern era. Mrs. Anderson has met all of the famous and the rich, including Eleanor Roosevelt and Mrs. Anwar Sadat. I'm looking forward to seeing her, so let's go inside now and find out about her past experiences and a little bit about this beautiful home in Bell Buckle. Ms. Anderson, it's a beautiful day in Bell Buckle. It seems like a special treat coming down here in October. I'm really impressed with your home and would like to know a little bit about the history of it.
Well, this house, I think, is about 105 or 10 years old. I went into town one time, Shelbyville, and did a title search to see when it was built. And I couldn't find out. I did find when the property deed was first recorded, but apparently it was just a piece of empty ground. And about 510 years ago, maybe, it said the land and appurtenances. Now, that could have been a chicken coop or a stable or this house. I don't know what the appurtenances were. But I understand this was built by a banker. Bell Buckle used to have a bank until one of General Patton's tank corpsmen knocked it down accidentally during World War II. That's true. And when we bought this, it was in a complete state of collapse. This porch had fallen in entirely. Excuse me, I have to cough. And one of the back rooms, the walls had bowed out, so we just had to knock them out. And we really had to do a lot of work on it, but we like it.
Well, it turned out beautifully. A renovation job is sometimes tougher than building a new house.
I think it was, yes. When we walked in here, we'd had a house in Shelbyville we'd sold. We bought this, and when we walked through it for the first time with all the previous owner's belongings out, my husband said, this is the biggest mistake we ever made in our lives, that this is impossible, but and it was not easy, but we finally got it put together.
Well, it's turned out beautifully. Let's go inside and take a look at a couple of the rooms and have our interview.
All right. Come in.
Ms. Anderson, you've got a lovely living room, fireplace, and clock. What's the history?
Well, you should have seen this fireplace when we bought the house. The previous owners had concreted it over and had a big concrete slab that went out into the middle of the room because they were using a, I think, wood-burning stove here. So my husband had to take a sledgehammer and knock all the concrete out, and we found the fireplace under there. But in knocking it out, unfortunately, he broke some of the tile there around the edge, and of course you can't match that old tile, but I did find some in Nashville that did very well. The clock came from Bryant Station, Tennessee, over here on the edge of Murray and Marshall County. You know where Bryant Station is?
Yes, ma'am, I sure do.
Yeah, my great-uncle Billy O had a store over there. And about a little over 100 years ago, my great-uncle Johnny Jones went down and bought that clock at the general store, and that's where that came from. And this, I don't know what you call furniture like that. It looks like the bottom of a Jackson press, kind of. And you see these, some people call them buffets, some call them presses of some kind. And you see this style of furniture with the rail in Middle Tennessee, and I don't think I've ever seen them anywhere else, but you see quite a few around here. And this one belonged to my great-great-grandmother, and I don't know who before she had it. And I think she brought it down from Old Hillsboro, Tennessee, which is up near Franklin, where she grew up when she got married and moved to Marshall County. So that's the history of that piece.
Well, it makes for a lovely atmosphere in here. What about this piece over by the door?
You mean that card table?
Yes, ma'am.
Actually, that's an English card table, and I think it dates from about maybe the mid-1700s, and I bought that at an auction in Los Angeles. The actress Billy Dove, who used to be, gosh, years ago, Howard Hughes's main squeeze, or whatever you call it, her daughter had a sale, and I bought that there. And this little melodeon came from North Carolina.
All right, let's try this one right over here.
Yeah, the little melodeon came from North Carolina. And that little chair we got in England when our first grandchild was born. I'd seen one kind of like it that Gary Collins and his wife Marion Mobley had for their little girl Clancy. So when I saw one sort of like it, I like mine better than Mary Ann's actually, we got it. And you can take it apart and it makes a little chair and table. It's a little high chair. And our grandchildren and great-grandchildren sit in it, sat in it.
You've created another nice room right across the way. Let's go over and visit that one and see what you have there.
All right. The furniture all over our house is a mixture of inherited furniture and furniture we bought here and there. And my husband always wanted a long case clock. So I was in Glastonbury, England, oh gosh, a long time ago, 30 years ago. And Glastonbury is where King Arthur allegedly was buried. I was writing a story for Coronet magazine, King Arthur slept here. And I bought that clock. It's a Patterson clock. Mr. Patterson was a well-known clockmaker who made clocks around 1750. And it's signed, and it ran perfectly, had its original brass. I bought the clock. I had it packed, shipped, crated, shipped back to Long Beach, California, brought through customs, delivered to our house in Manhattan Beach, California, and the whole thing cost $90. That was a long time ago.
that was a real deal, I think.
Yeah, well, back then things were cheap in England. In England, people were still struggling through the results of World War II, and people were selling their silver and their furniture and all sorts of things to try to pull through. Now, this is kind of interesting. You don't see these often, but over 100 years ago or more, young ladies did much fancy work. They didn't have television, so they'd sit in the evening with their mothers and their sisters and do things. And my grandmother, McLean, and her sisters made that out of their hair. Those are flowers made from human hair, all except the white one, and it's made from the horse's tail. My grandmother told me that they needed something white, and nobody in the family had white hair at that point, so they just went out and pulled the hair out of the horse's tail and made that one.
Well, that's highly interesting and makes for a good conversation piece every time somebody comes by.
Yeah, and these various and sundry Oriental type things, or Asian, I think is the politically correct thing to call them, things you see through the house, came from here and there. I'm a volunteer adult literacy teacher and work a lot with Asian students teaching English as a second language, and they've given me all sorts of little gifts, including that picture and that musical instrument. Now, the little angel is a santo from the Philippines. I was at the Manila Film Festival a couple of times, and that came from there and other things.
Well, you've got an interesting bedroom in here. Let's
all right.
Look at that one.
Came from my travels to film festivals and here and there. This bed was my great-great-grandfather's or his brother's. I'm not sure which one ordered it. It's a Prudent Millard bed that somebody over at Chapel Hill ordered from New Orleans in around 1830. And Prudent Millard was a French furniture maker. Two of his beds are over at the Athenaeum in Columbia, that's where that is. And in London, in the American Museum, there's a Prudent Millard room. I think that's the museum it's in. But anyway, somebody sent slaves with a wagon from Chapel Hill to New Orleans to pick up the bed they'd ordered, which at that time had a tester, you know, across the top. And when they got back to Chapel Hill with it, the tester was gone. And everybody said, "Hey, where's the tester?" And the slaves who'd gone to get it said they didn't know. And that's the last we've heard about it. I don't know what became of the tester. Although this little piece back here belonged to a woman we called Auntie. She was my grandmother's best friend, and she had no children, but she called my mother baby, so she treated us like her grandchildren. Anyway, this was in her family home, and it was in a house that General Grant used for headquarters as he was rampaging through. And so we call it the General Grant little chest of drawers. My daughter has a matching dresser that goes with it. So maybe General Grant put his shaving gear on that. I hate to think about it, but it's possible.
Well, Mrs. Anderson, I'm looking forward to a full interview with you. Why don't we go back into the living room and set up there
All right.
and talk about your experiences and all the people you've known.
Yeah, I didn't mean this to be a home show. All right.
Mrs. Anderson, you've had a marvelous career. You've met so many great people. I really don't know where to start, but let's talk about the type of work that you did. When you moved to California, you were already an established newspaper journalist, but you had the opportunity to work for fan magazines and do celebrity interviews. What would we mean by a fan magazine?
Well, the word fan comes from fanatic. And these are people who are fanatical about whatever it is. Somebody can be a UT football fan or an Elvis Presley fan or whatever. And at that time, there were magazines that were devoted exclusively to stories about the stars, first of motion pictures. Later they expanded into radio and television too. But we still sort of had fan magazines, People magazine and various others, are sort of the same kind, with this difference. I worked for the McFadden Bartels Company, and their flagship magazine was Photoplay, which was the largest of fan magazines and the most reputable, I think, I can safely say. And they also had TV, Radio Mirror, and Motion Picture. Yeah, that was the other one. And those magazines presented the stars in the most favorable light possible. We didn't tell out-and-out lies, unlike some of the tabloids now, or People, which are more apt to dig up scandal if possible. We figured we wanted to please the fans and try to tell the good about the stars if any could be found. And
Did you have a relationship with the studios where they wanted a story put in or star magnified a little bit?
Oh yeah, the studio publicists would call if they had knew somebody on the lot and were making a picture and say, oh, come out and eat lunch with Sandra Dee or do whatever you want, you know, whatever. But that didn't guarantee we were going to mention the name Sandra Dee or whoever the case might be. They were just, the studios were working us and we were working them. We'd also call publicists and studios and ask if we could talk to so-and-so and such and such. And also we worked somewhat just like straight newspapers. If there was some hard news involving a star, we'd go at it like a regular newspaper reporter, which I'd been for a long time. However, we did not use, I had, for instance, I'll back up, 2 or 3 police reporters who were working on downtown papers in Los Angeles who were stringers for Photoplay. And they'd call me and say, hey, George Maharis has just been arrested for indecent exposure at Tiny Nailer's restaurant, which was true, that had happened. And hope George didn't sue me, but it happened. Well, we didn't use that, but when we did want to know about something, call in and call one of these guys and say, would you get the police report on this, because we wanted the facts, sir. But generally it was things like the night the stars prayed at Debbie Reynolds' home, Crew. Billy Graham went up there, and Debbie invited in some of her friends, and Dr. Graham prayed with them and so forth and that. And and the readers like that kind of story. And one of the best, most successful stories I can remember that we did, Dick Van Dyke, God Was My Psychiatrist, because we found that readers were very interested in stories about health, mental or physical or spiritual for that matter. And everybody was interested in religion because everybody either had some notion about it, either they liked it or didn't, one way or the other. And in this case, Dick told how he, under the sudden new heavy pressure of being the star of the Dick Van Dyke Show and various other things, the pressure was getting to him until he was about to have a complete nervous breakdown. And his wife of that period, his first wife, urged him to make an appointment with a psychiatrist. So Dick made the appointment, but he started praying about it and praying about it. And the night before he was going to the psychiatrist, all of a sudden he felt the load drop off and he never went, and there you are. And, you know, stories like that, positive stories were popular.
Well, you hear people talk about star quality and you see people on the screen, but knowing them in person would be different. What is it we mean by star quality, and was it evident in these people when you were around them one-on-one?
Not necessarily. But as Joanna Moore said to Ryan O'Neal, she was his first wife, she said, honey, the camera is beginning to pick you up like you really are. You're looking mean on the screen. Well, it's true. You hear people say the camera doesn't lie, that some quality in a person the camera will pick up that you don't necessarily observe when you see this person on the street. And star quality is this thing the camera picks up that makes a person interesting. You can't define it, and you can't create it very well. People could be taught to behave like stars when they're under the old contract system, not to scratch their heads with their forks at dinner or anything like that. But star quality could not really be created exactly. And it's the thing, well, a good example, I always said, though Paul Newman said I was wrong, that there are certain people that if their name is on the marquee, people go to see the movie. They don't care what the movie's about. They don't care what this person's doing. Elvis Presley being the classic example. If it's an Elvis Presley picture, the Presley fans go. If it's a John Wayne picture, they don't go because the script's great. But Paul Newman said that wasn't true. I said, now you're a star. The name Paul Newman will draw people. He said, no, he'd made some pictures that were real duds. Didn't do business.
Well, I feel somewhat embarrassed interviewing you because you've been doing all these great interviews and I'm an amateur at doing it, but share with our viewers, if you would, the techniques of interviewing and what did you find that really worked for you?
Well, some people have a lot of little tricks to interviewing. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I have rhinitis. And I don't believe in the tricky thing. I mean, some people write down their 10 favorite questions and go ask, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you like to be, that type of thing. No. The main thing about doing an interview, I think, is to find out about something about the person you're interviewing. I've had some stars complain when I was an editor that I'd assign writers to talk with somebody, and the star would complain, you know, this person didn't even know my age or where I was born or my name, and just hit them cold and really not know what they were talking about. And that's not very flattering to the star you're interviewing. And the same applies to anybody you're interviewing, politician, anybody, public figure. Know something about them and find out what they might want to talk about or what you might want to talk about that's in their lives.
So you did a lot of background before you went out.
Yeah, and sometimes I have asked somebody, and this just doesn't apply to stars, as we're wrapping up, I can tell you a funny story here about that. This was a gospel music star. After I've done this long interview with her and everything, I said, is there anything you want to talk about I haven't asked you about? I always feel like there may be something you'd like to push that we haven't mentioned. She said, yes. When I was in the first grade, I was sexually molested by my teacher. I thought, well, for heaven's sakes, it had never occurred to me to ask, were you ever sexually molested by your first grade teacher? Hadn't crossed my mind.
That's a good story. Well, what would be the routine that you would follow in going about interviewing a star? And how would the interviews take place or be arranged?
It would depend on the star. Some of them whom I knew quite well, I could just call them at home and say, you know, can I send a writer out to talk to you, or may I come out and talk to you, or what? And you could go around the publicists and everything else, which sometimes would cause trouble with the publicity department. But usually you'd call the star's personal publicist or the studio where they were working and say, I'd like to talk to Rock Hudson or I'd like to talk to whoever. And they'd say either yes or he'll see you in hell before he'll talk to you, whatever the case may be. And you do it like that.
Did you find an advantage to being a woman?
Yes, I did when I was working city side, very much. I hated this liberated women stuff. When I was first working for daily papers, I was, way back then, I was the youngest person in the press corps usually, so you can see it was way back then. I was also the shortest, and I'd be the only woman there. And back then, men would step back if a woman came charging through, elbowing and stepping on their feet, you know, in a crowd. And I could get to the front of the crowd, I could get in a question, and if I started talking, the guys would step back a pace. Now, of course, I guess they'd knock me down, but there was a great advantage to being a woman before the women got liberated.
Well, let's talk about a couple of those times when you took advantage of that. You interviewed Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yes, that was one of those cases. There was a little small social gathering of some kind, and Mrs. Roosevelt was there, and of course all the men were circling around, and I just pushed my way through and got up front, and I started talking to her, and they were too polite to shove me to the back and say, shut up and sit down. And we talked a bit, and then she said she had to go, and she left, and I was the only one that got in any questions.
Well, what do you remember physically about Mrs. Roosevelt? I've read where she was so active and so busy that she didn't spend a lot of time on her personal appearance, didn't pay much attention to what she ate. She was involved with events and activities.
Well, I don't know. In the first place, she didn't have a lot to work with talking about personal appearance, and I mean that factually rather than unkindly. I've seen pictures of her when she was a young girl, and she was not really an unattractive young girl. She was tall and slim and didn't have greatest features in the world even then, but she wasn't a bad-looking girl. But as she got older, she was not slim anymore, and she really wasn't even as tall. She was a bit stooped then, and she was well put together. As I remember, she had on a flowered dress. It was sort of a tea occasion, and she was appropriately dressed, and just looked like Eleanor Roosevelt looked.
Well, there were two other famous women that were in the political world that you interviewed, and maybe we ought to mention those, Mrs. Anwar Sadat.
Oh, yes. What a terrific person, yes, indeed. I was in Egypt on vacation with my sister, and my sister worked in hospitals in Memphis, still does, for many years. And so she knew a doctor, an Egyptian doctor in Memphis, who I believe had been engaged to Mrs. Sadat's cousin or something. I mean, it was a close relationship. And he told Mrs. Sadat we were going to be in Egypt, so she invited us to come over to the presidential palace for the day. And we did, and she sent a car the next day to go somewhere else, but I didn't go, my sister went. Mrs. Sadat was an extremely impressive person. In the first place, she was a good-looking woman. She was smart, and she answered questions quite forthrightly. And it was before President Sadat was assassinated, of course, but he was leading a dangerous life. And I don't think the Camp David Accords had been signed. And I asked her how she could bear up under all the pressure. For instance, she told me that on one occasion her husband left home, didn't tell her where he was going, that he couldn't tell her everything. She didn't know where he was for several days, and then he came home again. But she said, yes, in the middle of the night, when the red phone would ring, I think it really was red, that her husband would answer the phone, and she would know that maybe the whole future of world peace was hanging on that conversation. But that when he hung up, she never asked him to whom he'd been talking. I bet she did, but she said she didn't, or what they'd said. But she said, I know God has put me in this position, so God will give me the strength to do whatever I have to do. And it was shortly after that he was assassinated, and that day when I heard that, I thought about it. I hoped God was giving her the strength to do what she had to do.
So you really felt like she was a close advisor to him?
Well, I don't know that she advised him. I didn't get that impression much, but that she certainly was a stalwart supporter of his and trusted him completely. She said that, I've forgotten exactly how she met him. He had been in jail, she said, as some kind of a revolutionist or something before he came to power. And she was a young girl. She was just out of school, or maybe still in school. But she went up to some town where she had some relatives or friends to visit them for the sole purpose of meeting Anwar Sadat. She had heard he was going to be there. And she said she just really had to meet that man. So she did, and he married her.
Well, switching halfway across the world to the Philippines, you met Mrs.
Marcos. Oh, yeah. I like Imelda Marcos very much. And I think the Marcos got bad press that was not deserved. I think, well, if I started telling the good about them, I'd go on too long, I think. I'm sure there was some bad about them. But just one little matter. All the publicity after he was deposed about her 300 pairs of shoes. I bought a lot of shoes in the Philippines because they were so cheap. It was a product of the nation. I don't know why they made so many shoes there, but you get nice shoes then for $1.50 a pair. And when I got home, and I've still got some of those shoes, they're still holding up. I thought, I bet you, if she's got 300 pairs of shoes, she probably hasn't paid any more for them than Jackie Kennedy or Nancy Reagan may have paid for one pair.
Well, what was one outstanding quality that you saw in her?
she really and truly, I believe, cared about the Filipino people. And I was at a party one night, and one of her, to which many rich Filipinos had been invited, her close friends, and one of her friends told me, said, you know, said, the Marcos don't dare tax us enough to take care of all Imelda's charitable and civic causes. And said, so she just tells us just to give the money. That if they raised taxes, it would sound awful, but she'd just lean on them and say, why don't you make a nice donation? And they did. But she was very active in encouraging volunteerism, that kind, and some not quite so strong, not so strong on methods, but also encouraging village work, that the women of villages have cottage industries. I met a man there sitting by a swimming pool. She'd flown him in from Harvard. He was some kind of a nutritionist, and she was going to take him out to some of these villages to teach women how to feed their children better. I mean, they had enough food, but what's nutritious, what isn't? And I think she truly loved the people.
Well, speaking of political figures, when you were a young journalist in Birmingham, I believe assistant city editor there,
Yeah.
you had the opportunity to interview then Vice President Harry Truman.
Yes, I did. And how that happened was very peculiar. I think I wasn't assistant city editor then. I did become, but I was a reporter. Came back from lunch one day, and the city editor, Naylor Stone, said, get a photographer and go with that man. I said, where are we going? He said, well, you'll find out. And I thought I was going to go see the man who'd written the streetcar song, you know, the Judy Garland sang.
Yeah, clang, clang, clang,
Yeah.
with the trolley.
I'd heard he was in town, and I thought, well, I'm going to go talk to the man who wrote the streetcar song. But we go out, the photographer and I, with this man, and we get in a Jeep. I thought, this doesn't look quite right. And pretty soon I realized I got security with me, all kind of security people. And we go way out a railroad track, a road along a railroad track, to a railroad car that's parked out there. I got on the car. I still don't know what I'm doing. This is one time I was not prepared for an interview at all. Go back into a compartment, and there sits Harry Truman. And I was stunned. I know my first question, and I don't know what he said for an answer. It was so long ago. I said, what in the world are you doing in Birmingham? That's the first thing. And then he got out and wanted to know if I wanted to take a walk with him along the platform, which I did. And the photographer kept saying to me, don't you want your picture taken? And I said, no. And the reason was I was extremely pregnant at the time, my second child, and I thought, well, the vice president will be embarrassed posing with me. And I wish now I'd done it.
Yeah. Well, what was your impression of Vice President Truman at that time?
He was very down to earth. I mean, he didn't expect any, I didn't have to fall to my knees and be admitted on my knees like to an Eastern potentate or anything. There was no formality about it. I didn't call him Harry or anything like that. But he was very informal, very friendly, very candid, and looking back, I think he was a pretty good president. At the time, I had some reservations, but I think he was one of our better ones.
Well, that's an interesting thing you bring up about the formality with people. Mm-hmm. You've interviewed all types of people. Referring to some of the stars, did you ever run across some of those that were extremely vain and arrogant?
Oh, sure. Well, yeah. Let me see. Well, I won't say this is vain and arrogant. It's just amazingly stupid, I think. Sean Penn, whom I don't know well, but I have talked to, as you know, was married to Madonna at one time. He also was in jail at one time for something, fighting with somebody or something. And so I'm with a little group of press. One of his new pictures that's coming out has been screened for us. And we're sitting there, and Sean Penn is going to come in and answer questions. And so the publicist said, now, you must not ask him anything personal. You must not ask him about Madonna. You must not ask him about being in jail. You must not ask him this, nothing personal.
It just about took the story away, didn't it?
Well, it's sillier than that. Here comes Sean Penn. And so one man says, Mr. Penn said, this publicist has been telling us that you're a real principal fellow, the publicist had, that you're the easiest actor to work with, that you're so unimpressed with your own fame and fortune, and that you're just too good to be true. I'm paraphrasing. So why is it the public has a different impression of you? And with that, Sean Penn walked out. Yeah. Uh, and, oh, somebody, an actress did the same thing one time, and I've forgotten what she was asked. It was nothing to upset her, but off she went.
Well, you did a lot of your interviews, I would assume, on movie sets.
A lot on movie sets, a lot of them in restaurants. Everything from studio commissaries to places like a La Scala Boutique, a Scandia, the Polo Lounge, some of the famous.
Well, for some people, the Brown Derby was a famous place. Was it really as famous as we think it is in Tennessee?
Yeah, the old original Brown Derby was up in Hollywood, and it was very famous, very famous. But then the Brown Derby, at which actually I think perhaps more stars gathered later, was the Beverly Hills Brown Derby. And I've done many an interview in there. And since I had an expense account from the magazines, I made it a point to always tip the maitre d' real well.
Well, give us a little flavor of what it was like to go into one of these places when people were there. And
well, I don't know. You just said, I'm here to meet so-and-so. Has she gotten here yet? Or has he gotten here yet? They said, Miss Anderson, he's back at that table. I'll take you back, or whatever. And you'd see a lot of stars in there eating, but...
not much table hopping going around?
No, not a lot, no. But the reason I tipped well, one example, one day I was taking Priscilla Presley to lunch, and when I got there, here's this crowd of people, looked like tourists mostly, jammed out front trying to get in, see if they can get tables. And I'm standing there trying to get to the door, and the maitre d' came out and said, Miss Anderson, I have a phone call for you. I'll take you the phone. I said, thank you, and we go on through the people back. He said, you don't have a phone call, but I have a table you can have, so I wanted to get you through those people. So it paid to tip the maitre d's in these places.
Well, obviously you had a way of making friends with people, and that helped create access to some of these folks.
Also, I had an expense account that helped create access to the tables, not to the not to the stars.
But
the stars didn't care about my expense account. Priscilla could have afforded her lunch even if I hadn't been paying.
Describe the activity on a movie set, particularly on a big movie where there's 2 or 3 big-name stars.
Well, that is such a general question. There's no way to describe it. Say, on a John Wayne movie, every time they got a break, Mr. Wayne would retire to his dressing room, and if he had a chess player on the set, take the chess player with him. He loved to play chess, and during breaks, he'd go back and play chess. And if someone didn't know, if he couldn't find a chess player, he'd take somebody back and teach him. And that's often what he did. And of course, I'd visit with him during his breaks. On Elvis's pictures, how I interviewed Elvis after the first time or two, it got to the point Elvis really wasn't doing interviews except with select few. And the colonel's office would call me and say, you want to come over and see Elvis tomorrow? He'd like to see you tomorrow. Sure, I'd love to. So you'd go over to the set, and you just go on to the set, and there'd be no publicist with me or anything, and Elvis would see me and nod or wave or something, and I'd sit down, and when Elvis got a break, he'd come over and sit down, and we'd talk. And one time I had a real funny experience. I went on the set, and Elvis was shooting a movie in which Rudy Valley was playing a tailor, and in the scene they were shooting, Elvis was being measured for a pair of trousers. So he was in his underwear, and Rudy Valley was measuring him. Well, Joe Esposito came over to him and said, Nancy, would you mind moving over here? And he takes me around behind the set where I can't see a thing. I said, sure, Joe, but what's the problem? He said, well, Elvis is embarrassed for you to see him in his underwear. I said, oh, come on, Joe, the whole world's going to see him in his underwear when the movie's released. But sure, I'll sit here. So that's how it was on an Elvis set. Various sets, I don't know, each set, the flavor depends on the stars.
Sometimes you read where some stars are difficult to work with on a set. They show up late, or they don't know their lines. Or
well, of course, Marilyn Monroe was one whom I didn't know, was one of the great classic unprofessional people. I had a good friend, a writer, who knew Clark Gable very well, was a good friend of his, and she always told me that Marilyn Monroe had killed Clark Gable, that she was so completely unprofessional on his last picture, The Misfits, that's what gave him a heart attack. As you probably read, Miss Monroe either wouldn't show up at all, or she'd come hours late, or whatever. She was quite difficult. And this drove people crazy.
You mentioned some of your dearest friends in terms of celebrity, so why don't we just talk about them now? John Wayne.
John Wayne was John Wayne. The John Wayne you see on the screen was the John Wayne who was off the screen. And he was quite gallant with women. I don't think he liked some of the stars who occasionally, their conversation got a little rough around women. I don't think he liked that. But he had a high temper sometimes, but if he got mad at a guy on the set, or a member of the crew he thought had made a mistake or something, he might lash out and really bless him out. But then if he realized that he'd made a mistake, the fellow wasn't responsible, he'd come out and apologize in an equally carrying tone of voice. He was a very fair man, I think. And he admitted that when he got home, this was when Pilar, his wife, had left him and stayed gone. He said in a way he didn't blame her, that when he came back from being on location on a picture in which he was starring, in which he was producing, or his son Michael was, that he was used to running the whole thing, that he made the decisions, what he said was the law, and everybody did what he said, and so he guessed he was hard to live with.
Well, you got along with him very well.
I sure did.
How did you establish a good relationship?
I don't know. But he was a really a friend to me. I really liked him. One of the proudest days of my life, my husband and I were invited up to a Pro-Am golf tournament Buck Owens was having for some charity in Bakersfield. And as we walked through the clubhouse, I see John Wayne sitting at the bar in the men's bar, and he says, "Come on in." And so I shoot through the door, and my husband said, "You can't go in there, that's a men's bar." I said, "John Wayne says I can come in, so I can go in." So I went in, and when I got in, Mr. Wayne picked me up and threw me around, and he says to my husband, said, "Did you know this is one hell of a woman?" And I told my husband, "If John Wayne says it, you know it's so." Yeah, he was a terrific person.
I always thought in watching movies as a youngster that Robert Taylor had real appeal and had real star quality about him. Did you know Robert Taylor?
Yeah, I interviewed him. I didn't know him real well. I knew Barbara Stanwyck much better. Robert Taylor
They were
was
married, is that right?
Well, for a while. They
For
were
a while.
divorced when I knew him, yeah. He was a nice young man from Nebraska, nice manners, gentleman, and he did obviously have star quality because he certainly had fans when he was under contract at MGM. Interesting story about this, though. Richard Allen, you remember who Richard Allen was? In the movie Wings, he and Buddy Rogers
I know who
were
you're
the
talking
two
about.
pilots.
Yeah, I know who you're talking
To back up a little, Richard Allen had flown in World War I. He was a Canadian. And he must have been very young, but he did fly in World War I. And he told me when they were making Wings that they wanted Gary Cooper to play the part he got. And he said Coop could act, but he couldn't fly. He said, "I could fly, but I couldn't act." So they took the one who could fly because Buddy Rogers and Richard Allen did their own flying, but to go forward. Richard Allen was very staunchly anti-communist, as was Robert Taylor. And he said that when one of the committees investigating communist influence in the movie industry, and there was a lot, was out to do interviews in Hollywood, call in witnesses, Richard Allen and Robert Taylor were subpoenaed. And he said they went down to the hearing together. And he said he's walked in, every communist in Hollywood was standing there, and he said he could really feel the hate, that it was just radiating in the room. But he said he and Taylor weren't worried, said they were pretty tough guys. So they go up and they testify and so forth. He said when he got back to his studio, he'd already been replaced in the movie he was making. He said, "You're always hearing about the Hollywood 10 not being allowed to work." But said he went back, was already out of his movie, had been replaced by Sterling Hayden. He said Robert Taylor, after that, never got a movie that had a completed script or had the director assigned when he was put into it. He was under contract, so he couldn't help himself. Said from then on, his career was just deliberately ruined. And he gave me was it Leo McCarey? I've forgotten. Some producer who had won an Oscar the year before, he said that he testified against the communists and he never worked again. And he told me about another fellow, a producer director, and I've forgotten who it was, that was under contract at a studio, and when he got back, the furniture was gone out of his office. And that he said, "Okay, I'm coming to work anyway because I've got a year's contract and I'm going to show up, so you have to pay me my salary whether you want me here or not." So he just brought a chair from home and sat in the empty office for a year and picked up his paycheck, but never got to work anymore.
Well, I've seen those tapes of Robert Taylor testifying before Congress, and I believe that anyone who would watch that would say he made a real hit with the American people, even if he didn't help his career any in Hollywood.
Well, Robert Taylor and John Wayne and Richard Allen, I suppose, Adolph Menzies, had a hopper of all people. and a number of others formed a group in Hollywood through which they pledged they would not work on any picture that had a communist starring in it, that was directed by a communist, written by a communist, or produced by a communist. So Larry Parks, whom you may remember, he played Jolson in the Jolson story.
I remember that.
And had a good career taken off. He admitted publicly that he'd been a member of the Communist Party, but he recanted and said he was out of it, he was sorry, he would tell everything he knew and so forth. Well, John Wayne said, that's good enough for me. I'll be glad to work with Larry Parks any time. Well, Wayne told me this made Hedda Hopper so mad at him, John Wayne, that she was a very powerful columnist, that she would never again promote anything he did. He said, I thought she was going to hit me.
Well, you mentioned Hedda Hopper, and she had a large following around the country because she was what you would call a gossip columnist, I guess, and she had a radio show.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and what was the other one?
Luella Parsons.
Luella Parsons. What do you know of those two in their age?
I knew Hedda Hopper fairly well because when I was editor of Photoplay, in a fashion, she worked for me, though I certainly didn't give her any orders, but she was a columnist for Photoplay. And she called me, she said, I want to give you my home number, and anytime you need help with anything at all, you call me immediately. And I did call her a few times, and she was always very helpful. And I really liked her. And Luella Parsons, I didn't know as well. I went to parties with Luella Parsons there. You heard some pretty funny stories about her sometime. But poor Miss Parsons was drinking a good deal when I knew her. She was in her latter days. And she also had a tendency to wet the floor at parties. That's true. You may want to edit that out.
No,
but
that's good.
She did. She was in pretty poor condition. And I know Hedda Hopper. And poor Luella wound up in a convalescent home where I think she sat and didn't know who was coming and who was going for months, which was pitiful. Hedda Hopper, on the other hand, took pneumonia and was dead in about 2 days. And I know she's glad that's how she went.
But those were two famous people for those who followed the movies closely.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of stars, I think we've all at one time or another tried to copy a star after we saw a movie or whatever. Comment on the impact of Hollywood on American morals and values.
Well, I think it's had a horrible impact. Used to be there were morals clauses in stars' contracts. So a star, that's why Clark Gable and Carole Lombard got married. They were living together and the word got out and the morals clause made them get married. Though they were devoted. He was madly in love with her and she with him, I guess. So they probably would have married anyway. But stars had to sort of toe the line publicly and set a slightly better example for young people who went to the movies. Also, if they did get into mischief, the studio covered it up pretty well. I don't think anybody will ever know the true story about Jean Harlow's husband who killed himself because the studio was on that case immediately. And there's some thought that a mistress he'd had before he married Miss Harlow had killed him because she was mad because he'd married Jean Harlow. But that cannot be established and never will be because Louis B. Mayer shut that down in a hurry. And the publicist who was on duty at MGM when Spencer Tracy died in Katharine Hepburn's bed, told me that that was a terrible thing, that he was really young and new at the job, and they called him and said, Spencer Tracy's dead in Katharine Hepburn's bed. Miss Hepburn called, in fact. So he called Louis B. Mayer, called the head of publicity, I guess, or Bill Golden or somebody, or Howard Strickland, he was head of publicity. He said, what am I supposed to do? He said, well, Stahl said, all the press in the world will be calling and just tell them you don't know where he died, you don't have the particulars, the funeral arrangements haven't been made, you don't know a thing, so just stall them off and we'll straighten this out for you have to make a statement. So that's what they did.
Hollywood used to have a code about what could be said and what could be seen on the screen, and now we've gone 180 degrees in the other direction. What caused that?
Well, I guess producers decided that the more outrageous or shocking or embarrassing even the action on the screen, the more people they'd attract to the movies. And I think that works up to a point, but I think it also drives a lot of people away. Dick Van Dyke said one time it was hard enough to find a movie to take your children to, but said try finding one you can take your mother to. I think it does. It drives a lot of people away. And some of the pictures that have made the most money in recent years, like Big and various things, clean pictures. Yeah. I was at Ronald Reagan's house one day when the pictures were just beginning to get risque or bawdy or whatever the word should be. And at that time, Patty was about 6, 7 years old or something. And Mr. Reagan was complaining about the quality of movies that were coming out. And he said that Patty wanted to take some little friends to the movies for her birthday. So he said, yes, he and Nancy would take Patty and her little friends. He said, then the problem was, what movie can we see? And he looked through the pictures, and there was one starring Dick Van Dyke. No, not Dick Van Dyke, what am I saying? Dick Chamberlain. And he thought, well, with that nice young Dr. Kildare starring, it must be a nice, clean picture. Turned out to be quite the otherwise. He took them and said he really wished he could get those little girls out of there.
Well, you brought up Ronald Reagan. Did you know him very well?
Not well, but I knew him. I think I might be the first person who asked him to run for political office. He was the spokesman, you know, for what, General Electric?
General Electric, right.
And in that capacity, he sometimes addressed women's clubs, I guess on buying a new stove or something, I don't know what. But he made a talk to a club down at Palos Verdes. I was still working on a daily paper then. I wasn't working full-time for magazines, just freelancing for them. But he had made this talk to a women's group in Palos Verdes on economics, and I thought it made such good sense. I called him, and I said, I'd like to enlarge on that. Could I come talk to you some more about your ideas? And he said, sure, come on up. So I went up to his house. And while I was there, I said, California is going to have a Senate seat coming up pretty soon. And why don't you run for the Senate? Because getting elected now depends on how you handle yourself on television. And you can certainly do it. I said, look at that young congressman from Massachusetts, John Kennedy. And he said, no, he wasn't interested in public office at all. No, he wasn't interested in that. So George Murphy, another actor, did run and did get elected,
right.
yeah. Mm-hmm. And then later, of course, Reagan got more interested in running.
Well, in our conversation in the last few minutes, two things you've mentioned I'd like for you to refer to. One, Hollywood parties. I guess people in this part of the country have all kinds of visions of what a Hollywood party would be, but I'm sure they were lavish with the amount of wealth that was available.
Well, there were all kinds of Hollywood parties. One that I remember as being innovative and interesting, Harold Robbins, the novelist,
yes,
had a New Year's Eve party at his house, and he carried out a kind of Arabian Nights theme, and he'd taken all the furniture out of his house. I guess he'd had some van line pick it up and store it for the evening, and then bring it back the next day. He had all the floors, walls, and ceilings covered with Oriental rugs, I mean good ones. So the house looked like a sultan's tent, and there were cushions on the floor, and the pool area was carpeted around with Oriental rugs, and had Oriental rugs over it. And then on the swimming pool, he had gold-covered boats. They looked like they were made of gold, but I'm sure they weren't, with girls dressed in harem costumes, sitting on piles of fruit in the boats, wearing slave bracelets, gold-looking ones, throwing fruit to people. And David Jansen got in one of the boats. He crowded in, and he was sitting there with one of the girls. It was an interesting party. But one of the, I got to tell you about this one. Merle Oberon.
Gosh, you're really going back to the old stars.
Yeah, but this wasn't all that long ago, about 20-something years, a good while. Merle Oberon was married to a Mexican kind of a gangster. He wasn't a roughneck-looking gangster. He was quite personable and polished and attractive man. But she made her last movie while she was married to him. And so before it was released, and I don't know whether it was ever released, I guess it was, she invited some press, or a couple, practically no press, a few people to come down as her guest to Mexico City, where they were going to have its premiere. So down we go, and the group includes Dorothy Manners, who had succeeded, she'd been Hedda Hopper's assistant, and she'd succeeded Hedda in doing that column, and her husband, Marvin Jones, a girl who worked for the Hollywood Reporter, my husband and me. Then there was Lex Barker and Cary Grant. So we go down, and the first night we have dinner at Miss Oberon's house, and it was just a lovely formal dinner. And I kept telling my husband, take a look at the walls. She had great masters, original Goyas and things like that, just all over. But the next night, a friend of hers entertained us, and she was a Texan who was married to a Mexico City banker. And they had a house that was so huge that during the evening, my husband and Lex Barker got off and paced off the foundations, and it was the size of a football field. And they had a swimming pool, indoor and out, of course, Olympic size practically. But in the room with the bar, the husband apparently was a big game hunter, and he had all kinds of huge stuffed animals standing around that he'd shot here and there. There was a half of a giraffe coming out of the wall looming over you. And as I said at the time, when you're standing at the bar and find a white rhinoceros on one side of you and Cary Grant on the other, it's enough to make you quit drinking. And we go out to eat dinner, which we eat around the indoor pool. Again, oriental rugs all over the pool area. During dinner, I hear this roar, and I think, oh my goodness, Mount Popocatépetl is erupting or something. And then the roof disappears. I thought, uh-oh, and you can see the stars. Well, what they have some kind of machinery, that was the roar, that would roll back the roof. And you could sit there and look at the stars. That was an interesting party.
Well, you've mentioned these houses, and I think when I talked to you earlier, you mentioned George Hamilton's house.
Ah, George's house, yeah. George bought the house that Douglas Fairbanks Sr. had owned before he married Mary Pickford. And it was a very nice house. It wasn't as nice as Pickfair, but it was a lovely house. And when George bought it, he had a party to show off his residence, and we go up there, and there's nothing in the residence except George's brother Bill lying on the floor looking around. Bill said he was a decorator. He was going to decorate the place. Well, somebody did, and it got to be a lovely home. George, I think, has sold that one long since. But, oh yeah, I know he has, because when he sold it, I guess, was short of cash, because he announced he was going to sell his house and everything in it, including his mother's clothes. His mother, Ann Hamilton, lived with him, and Ann didn't mind. And he would charge $5 a person to come into the sale. So my daughter and I go up, because she's dying to go into George's house, and we pay our $5 each and go in. And Ann Hamilton's standing there, and she said, "You didn't pay to get in here, did you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, here, take your money back." So she gave us the money back.
That sounds like a star in trouble, charging $5 for
Well, I think George might have been short of cash then, yes. But my daughter bought a table there that she uses now as a coffee table, but it was one Gloria Swanson had brought there and left. Gloria Swanson, for some reason, came to be their house guest and brought some furniture with her, including a table that I guess was about this high when she started. But she decided she'd lower it a little, so she personally took a saw and cut off the legs, and she got them crooked. And she kept sawing them off and sawing them off and sawing them off. So finally my daughter bought the table, and she had the legs even and used it for a coffee table.
Well, let's combine two things that you've brought up. Mm-hmm. Somewhere in your assignments, you got to seek out the real old stars.
Yeah, I did.
Francis X. Bushman, and at the same time, you got to go into some estates like Mary Pickford and what was it?
Buddy Rogers.
Buddy Rogers.
He of Wings. He was a second after.
So
I think actually
there are two things there I'd like you to elaborate on. Some of the old stars that you got to interview, and some of those old homes, like what Pickfair is that?
Well, better than the old stars, I love to interview the old line directors because they'd tell you anything. They didn't tell, they'd tell you. I love Royal Walsh, talking to him. I've interviewed, of course, Alfred Hitchcock and Frank Capra and Royal Walsh and Howard Hawks, and there were one or two I never did get to interview. I never did interview Louis Milestone. I kept calling him.
Is there one named George Zukor?
Zukor, I knew some Zukors. There were, yeah, George Cukor, you're thinking of. Yeah, I've interviewed him, and he was famous as a woman's director. Women actresses seemed to like working with him. But John Ford, through John Wayne, I knew him. I was very honored. One day I was on a Wayne set, and I saw John Ford come in, and John Ford didn't talk to people much unless you were working for him. And Wayne called me, come in the dressing room. He said, "I want you to meet my friend Jack Ford." So I interviewed John Ford. I mean, I chatted with him for a good while, but there were some true horror stories told about John Ford. He was very rough on his actors, but he got performances out of them. Some actors, after working with him, hated him, but others knew what he'd done for them, and they appreciated it. Of course, John Wayne just loved him dearly. And maybe I've told you earlier how he got Victor McLaughlin to give his performance in The Informer that I think won an Oscar for him. At least it got him a nomination. There's a scene in which, this is about the Troubles in Ireland, and Victor McLaughlin was playing a member of, I don't know whether it's the Irish Republican Army, but anyway, the rebel group, who turns informer on one of his friends who gets killed as a result. I've forgotten the plot exactly. Maybe he didn't mean to do it. I don't know how this happened. But there's a scene when McLaughlin realizes he's been caught, that he's trapped, that they know he's an informer, and he is playing a man who's not too bright anyway, and he's terrified and he's befuddled, and he does a great job. Well, how Ford got him to do it, I've been told. He kept him out drinking, which wasn't hard to do, till about 3 in the morning, then said, okay, go home and go to bed. And about an hour later, he came and grabbed him out of bed and said, all right, on your feet, let's go to work. And so McLaughlin probably was so hungover, that's why he gave the great performance.
You mentioned Alfred Hitchcock. You talked to him?
Oh, yes. Alfred Hitchcock was notable for his some of his practical jokes. For instance, and I was not at this, but I heard he gave a dinner party once and dyed all the food blue. I had somebody dye it blue. He had blue mashed potatoes, blue gravy, blue chicken, blue everything, and he didn't comment on this. He just watched his guests as they tried to eat the blue food, and a lot of people just couldn't do it.
Let's finish out this first part by talking a little bit more about some of the oldest stars that you met. You mentioned Gloria Swanson. Did you ever meet her?
Oh, yes. I had an experience with her. She invited me to lunch, and she was very proud of her figure, which she did maintain to the bitter end. Old Joe Kennedy would have been happy about that. You know,
yeah, I know the
they were
relationship.
chums.
They were
okay.
a strong relationship.
Yes, really. So we were having lunch in her dressing room, and all she's having for lunch, and all I can have either, like the blue potatoes, I couldn't eat it, some really nasty green, gray-looking stuff that looks like some kind of mush, and she explains to me that this is a wonderful health food. It's full of vitamins and seaweed and I don't know what all. And she said, you see, I don't have an ounce of fat on me. I said, you look wonderful. She said, here, feel. And she takes my hand and sticks it under her shirt and has me pat her all around. I said, oh, Miss Swanson, I'm sure you have no fat. I didn't want to be pinched. She said, pinch. I didn't want to be pinching Gloria Swanson.
That's a marvelous
now, yeah, Joe Kennedy might have enjoyed it, probably did.
You'd rather been pinching Elvis, right?
No, I didn't want to pinch Elvis either. He thought of me as his mother, I think.
Well, what about some of the other old ones? Did you meet Francis X. Bushman?
Yes, I knew Francis X. Bushman to a certain extent. And he told me, well, what I was doing when he was telling me this story, I met him several times, I was doing a story about the, I think the working title was If You Touch Me, I'll Scream, about the ends to which women would go to get into situations with male stars that would then permit them to start screaming and either have them arrested or sue them or call the cops or something like that. And the guys were usually quite innocent, and that's the reason many male stars, Elvis, Ricky Nelson, others, always had a coterie of people around them all the time as witnesses, so nobody could charge them with attempted rape or whatever. Even Donny Osmond got named in a paternity suit of all the silly things. But Francis X. Bushman said, yes, he had had this woman that was so obsessed with him that she showed up at the lot where he was working, and that's when the lots were much more informal, wearing a wedding dress. And she claimed he'd asked her to marry him, and she'd come to enjoy the ceremony. And he said he had to escape by jumping over the back fence.
We've got about a minute and a half
all
left.
right.
A quick comment on Mary Pickford and Buddy Rogers. They were the greats in their time.
Well, he wasn't as great as she was. He was known as a debutante's delight. When he led a band, he started as a band leader, and he was some younger than she, but they were married for a long time, I guess very happily. Mary was drinking pretty hard by that time, and I only went up to Pickfair once, but Buddy showed me all around, and it was quite impressive. In their recreation room, the walls, like Merle Oberyn's dining room, covered with original paintings of value. He had Remingtons all over the place. And then he showed me the china. He said it was a set that Napoleon had given Josephine. And I said, did you and Mary ever wonder what Josephine served the last time she used that china? He said, no, it hadn't crossed his mind. But Mary Pickford, he said, now you want to talk to Mary, don't you? I said, oh, sure. And he said, well, just a minute. And I thought she was going to come downstairs or something. I hadn't seen her around. He picks up a house phone. He said, Mary Nancy's here. You want to talk to her, don't you? Apparently she said yes, so he hands me the phone. She's upstairs. She never does come down. And she was getting real old and in bad health and also into the bottle some, I believe. And it was an interesting visit.
This concludes part one of our conversation with Nancy Anderson, who interviewed so many stars through the years and now resides in Bell Buckle. Thank you. Welcome to Recollections, the Middle Tennessee Voices of Their Time series, a look at the past through the experiences of Middle Tennesseans. I'm Bob Bullen of Middle Tennessee State University, in part two with my guest, Mrs. Nancy Anderson of Bell Buckle, Tennessee, who received a lot of fame as a newspaper journalist, but more importantly, working with Fan magazine. She interviewed many of the great celebrities that graced the American screen and were later seen on American television. She knew them all, from the rich to those who later became famous. It started off slowly, and such as Elvis Presley, who came from nothing to be one of the greatest stars of this century, to others like Doris Day and Rock Hudson, and so Nancy, we talked about a lot of famous people in the first half, but two of your favorites we didn't get to, so let's take Elvis Presley first. How did you meet him, and how did y'all establish such a good relationship?
I think Elvis came to like me because, one, I was from Tennessee, and two, he could trust me. When I first met Elvis, I was asked to go do a magazine story with him or something. Maybe it was a newspaper story or something. I didn't even want to. I thought he was just an idiot who had been created by publicity and would be a flash in the pan or whatever. The minute I met him, though, I truly liked that young man. He was intelligent. You don't get that impression when people talk about him now. But he was very bright. He wasn't terribly well educated, though he read a lot, was trying to improve himself all the time, I think. And when I first met him, he hadn't been in Hollywood long. I guess he was making maybe his first picture, I don't know. And people made fun of him. You were always reading little jokes about Elvis and snide comments. And he told me, he said, ma'am, I think that somebody up there must really be watching me, because otherwise I would have made a fool of myself. Said, I've seen things in the past few years I didn't even know existed. And I know that's true. And that, I think, is why he liked me. He knew I wasn't going to make fun of him, because I wasn't. I liked him. And we sort of went down life's highway together. I think I was the last member of the press to talk with Elvis. I was invited to go to, I believe it was maybe Tahoe, somewhere he was opening, and I'd go up there and they'd give me a nice front ringside table, and after a while somebody'd come out if they were going to invite me backstage, which they did if they invited me up, and say, you want to come back and talk to Elvis? So I went back and talked to him.
Well, apparently Elvis had tremendous sex appeal. Could you sense that by...
Oh, well, women, oh my gosh, the women chased him so violently, and word was out, I guess, that I really and truly knew him. And fans would come up to the photoplay office, including some of the craziest ones that ever were in the world. One was named Mad Lorraine, who came armed to the teeth. She brought a pistol in a purse. She was a pistol-packing mama. And she'd come up there and talk about how she was going to kill Priscilla or Colonel Parker or Elvis or herself. She'd bought a cemetery lot in Memphis and didn't want to go to waste. And when she'd leave, I'd call the colonel's office and say, Mad Lorraine's been here, and she's armed and dangerous, and I think she's heading your way. And Tom Diskin, who was the colonel's right-hand man, said, well, I got one of the boys to meet her and take out and get her a drink, and she'll calm down. But there were others that came up who were monogramming sheets. One thought she was actually married to Elvis, which she certainly wasn't. I mean, oh, it was a sight.
Well, that was quite an entourage of characters that Elvis kept around him.
Right, but it began with a lot of his homeboys, boys from Memphis he'd gone to high school with, or from Mississippi, and cousins of his, a lot of relations in the group, and he had them with him for several reasons. One, as I was saying a little while ago, a male star sort of needs witnesses around to counteract rape charges and paternity suits. And also, he wanted somebody he could talk to. He couldn't sit down and talk to most of the other people in Hollywood. He's afraid they'd make fun of him or something. So he and his boys, they just hung out like they'd been doing in Memphis. And later, I said to him, Elvis, you know what people are saying about you. Anytime, you know, a group of young men are hanging around together, people began to say, yeah, well, we know about that. He said, yeah, I know what they say. He said, but look at it this way. He said, that's because they have on blue jeans. Said if they were wearing gray flannel suits, that's when the man in the gray flannel suit was a new picture with Gregory Peck.
I remember that.
He said nobody'd say a thing. He said every one of these has a job. He said Joe is my bookkeeper. And Joe was. He'd been an accountant. Now, Elvis met him, I think, in the Army before he met Elvis. And somebody else, Elvis said, takes care of the automobiles, has to see that they're gassed, washed, oil changed, whatever. Somebody else does something else, and said they've all got jobs. He said, but somebody has to be the boss, and I'm the boss. And that's why he had all these people.
Well, what do you think about Elvis's death? There's been all types of speculation on that. Did you have a theory?
I went down to talk to Vernon, his daddy, right after he died. In fact, I did a story with Vernon for Good Housekeeping. And Vernon said, you just don't know how sick Elvis was. He said he had high blood pressure. He said, I was always saying, son, you're going to have a stroke. And said he was going blind with glaucoma. And Vernon says, I think God had his hand on Elvis and took him when it was time for him to go. He said, can you imagine Elvis blind or paralyzed? I said, no. And Vernon said, yeah, well. I said, well, what about those drugs, though, Vernon? He said, doctors give a lot of stuff they shouldn't. He said, you should see my medicine cabinet. He said, maybe I should see in yours. He said, people all take too much medicine. I said, you're right, right.
Well, what about the rest of his family? Priscilla was his wife?
Priscilla, yeah.
Did you have much
Oh, yeah,
of a
I knew
relationship
Priscilla.
with
Oh, yeah, I knew Priscilla. In fact, I still do know Priscilla, I guess. When Elvis's stepmother, Dee, started going on the Geraldo show and talking to the National Enquirer, telling some really bizarre stories, I called Priscilla, and she took the call. She still knew me. And I said, you know, have you been listening to Dee? She said, yes. I said, what are we going to do about that woman? I said, I'll ask your lawyer. And she said, well, she had, and she didn't think she could do anything. But, yeah, I know Priscilla.
Some people say Colonel Parker took advantage of Elvis, and others say that he was the best friend he ever had. Do you have observation on
I
that?
like the Colonel a lot, and I think without Colonel Parker, there wouldn't have been an Elvis Presley as we know him. I mean, there would have been someone named Elvis Presley. But the Colonel was as sharp as a tack, and he did control the scene, although when Elvis had become a big star, Colonel couldn't make Elvis do something Elvis didn't want to do. It's just like they say about being hypnotized. I don't know whether this is true or not, but I've heard that under hypnotism you won't do something you're not really willing to do. Well, if Elvis wasn't willing to do it, the Colonel couldn't have made him do something. Yeah, I like the Colonel, and I think he took good care of Elvis. And Vernon liked the Colonel a whole lot. Vernon said that, well, Elvis had formerly been managed by somebody who was managing Johnny Cash, and Elvis came home, this is in the early stages, and told his mom and daddy he'd met a man named Colonel Parker, and he wanted him to manage him. And Vernon told me he didn't know about that. He didn't know anything about Colonel Parker. But he met the Colonel, and he liked him, and there you were.
Fame and wealth can suddenly come on some people. Comment on how that can really change them, or the changes you saw in some folks.
Some people haven't changed much at all, and some change very radically. Of course, sometimes talking to new young performers, I'd ask, are you ready for superstardom? I mean, you may make the picture, and suddenly you're a household name, and girls are screaming to climb over your fence and all this, and you're ready to handle it. They always say, oh, yes, 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 I'm very level-headed, and it'll be just the same. But it's hard for it to be the same, because when someone is telling you day and night, or crowds are, that you're the greatest invention since the wheel or whatever, you get to believe it. Can't help it.
Well, what about in your own situation? You got to mingle with the very best. Did you start visualizing yourself as a really fortunate reporter, or a special reporter, or?
It was a case of yes and no. I knew I was fortunate to get a lot of perks. I got to travel all around the world at somebody else's expense usually, and though I've traveled some at my own expense, I did get to talk to a lot of interesting people, some of them very interesting. On the other hand, some of them very boring I had to talk to. And also, having worked cityside on newspapers and general reporting, and I'd won some awards that way, I sometimes was embarrassed. I told Ryan O'Neal one time when he had left his wife, a good friend of mine, for Barbara Parkins, I said, Ryan, with the thought I'm putting in on you and Barbara Parkins, I could cure cancer and end war, and this is ridiculous. And I thought Ryan might be offended, but he said, yeah, I know what you mean. And greatest than that, a wonderful writer named Mike Bezier, one of the best writers I ever ran across. Mike had a contract with TV Guide, and he was sent out to interview Dean Jones, who's a very nice man and very bright. If you have to talk to somebody, Dean does real well. But he said all of a sudden in the interview with Dean, he said, "Dean, if I have to hear one more actor say one more word, I'm going to throw up." And said, so he turned around and went back and quit at TV Guide.
You wrote for several magazines. Were there any particular interviews that just sort of made you as one of the key people that got to do these things and were called on? Was there a breakthrough for you somewhere?
Well, actually, with any magazine, including when I was editor at Photoplay, every editor gets to working with just a handful of writers usually. You know what those writers can do. You know if they say they're going to do this, they can do it, that they can get to the subject, they will turn out a story you can use. And once you get the foot in the door, they turn to call you back, you know. I don't know how new writers get started doing freelancing for big magazines now, because there are not as many big magazines, for one thing. I mean, a lot of them I've written for in my time have gone out of business. And I got lucky on one thing. This was not the first national magazine I wrote for, but I did a lot for Good Housekeeping, and that was because I knew the editor. She'd worked for Photoplay, and we'd worked together, and so when Mary got over Good Housekeeping, she'd call me sometime.
Tell me why those magazines went out of business. They were really popular, and they sold huge quantities of
the fan magazines, I don't exactly know why, because I think we still have fan magazines after a fashion, though they're...
But they've changed in terms of what they produce.
That's right. They're not as complimentary to the stars now. I just don't know why the others went out. Maybe the public appetite for scandal has increased a whole lot, and you have to have a scandalous publication.
Well, that's sort of what I had in mind, and I wanted to see what your reaction was.
Yeah, I think so, probably.
Well, we've mentioned several of your favorites, but the one we haven't mentioned is Barbara Stanwyck, and she had a long and amazing career. What did you find about her that was so attractive?
She was one of the brightest and most professional people in the world, and probably the most popular actress with crews and people behind the camera that has ever been on a set. Members of crews who worked with Barbara Stanwyck just loved her because she was on time, she knew her lines, she did not take advantage of them, she was never thoughtless. She did many secret charitable works for crew members. I know she sent one man's daughters to college after he got too sick to work, and she didn't, you know, you didn't hear about this unless you just happened to find out some way. It wasn't publicized. And she'd come up to the office and bring me books sometime. I have several here that Barbara Stanwyck brought me just because we'd been talking about something and she'd think this subject would interest me. But that's not why I liked her, not for free books. It was because she was just a splendid woman, really was. And when Lee Majors, I hope I don't get sued if anybody hears this. Lee, I'm sorry, I forgive you, son. But anyway, he did sue me once. When Lee Majors first got into the Big Valley, it was all around town that success had gone to his head. He'd been the recreation director at, I think, North Hollywood Park or something. And he was being very difficult to work with on the set, hard to do business with. And so Barbara Stanwyck, I know this part's true, she finally went to the producers and she said, I'm not going to put up with what this boy is doing to the crew, that it's making it so hard to work on this set. She said, so one of us is going to go. He's going, I'm going, and I don't give a damn which one it is. Well, you know which one they wanted to keep. So they called Lee's agent or his manager or something and told him Lee'd better shape up, something that had to be done. So Lee did. He apologized. Miss Stanwyck said he didn't need to apologize to her. She didn't care anything about that, but he apologized and it blew over.
Did you find in talking with all these people that they were one-dimensional, that is, the ability just to act or perform in front of the camera, or were many of them had various pursuits, interests, were well-read, some of them perhaps well-educated? What did you find?
Oh, some of them were very well-read and well-educated, and some of them were dumber than the floor. I mean, could hardly remember their names. Let me see. Robert Mitchum, great surprise. Robert Mitchum, a very intelligent man. I think I don't know, he may have dropped out of high school. He didn't have much formal education, but he was self-educated and well-read, liked poetry. You don't think of Mitchum as a poetry-type person. but he could also be rough as a cob.
Well, he did have some rough early days. He had a bout with, I believe, arrested for marijuana in the 40s. But he ended up being an idol with the American public.
He was I think he was one of the best actors I ever met. I think he is the most underrated actor. His performances are so good in so many things.
Well, even at the end there in Winds of War.
Good.
Just marvelous performance.
Yeah, I'll tell you a little story. It didn't happen with me and Robert Mitchum, though I had some experiences with him too, but not this one. A friend of mine, Ruth Waterbury, who worked for Luella Parsons, told me this story from way back when he was making the story of G.I. Joe. Ruth was such a lady, and such a nice lady. She was a daughter of a New England attorney, and she's the kind that wore white gloves and hat when she went out on the street, because that's what people did then if they were suitably attired. And so Miss Parsons said to her one day, "Ruth, I think you better go talk to this young Mr. Mitchum and see what he's like, who's doing this story of G.I. Joe." So Ruth called the studio, and they said, "Oh, here's his home number, just call him and set up an interview." He was so unimportant, that's how they handle it. So Ruth did, and he said, "We'll come up in the morning at 10 or something." So Ruth goes up there, and she said when she got to the house, she figured Dorothy Mitchum wasn't at home. There were beer cans all over the porch and the yard. She knocks on the door. "Hello, I'm Ruth Waterbury from Luella Parsons' office." Mitchum says, "Hello, I'm Robert Mitchum, come in." And he opens the door, and he's stark naked. And Ruth said she hoped that she didn't bat an eye, that he thought everyone she talked with was naked, or that she was blind. So he said, "Come in, Miss Waterbury, I'm just cooking my breakfast. Would you come to the kitchen?" So they go back to the kitchen. And he's squeezing orange juice, still as naked as the day he was born. "Would you like some orange juice?" She said, "No, thank you." So then he starts breaking eggs in the skillet. Said, "I was just going to scramble some eggs. You sure you don't want some eggs?" She said, "No, I came to interview you. If you'd rather eat breakfast, I'll leave." He said, "Oh, hell yes, I want to be interviewed. Let me get my pants." So he went and got his pants and dressed, and she said neither one of them had mentioned that to the other since. But he was unpredictable in many ways.
A character. Well, I think it's only appropriate that we find out how you got into all this and search back into your earlier days and your background a little bit. Where were you born, and a little bit about your early education?
Well, actually, all my parents, grandparents, both my parents, my grandparents, great-grandparents, and way on back were from Middle Tennessee. In fact, I'm a member of the first families of Tennessee, you know, people whose ancestors were here before Tennessee was a state. But I was born in Maryland because my father was in the Army during World War I, and my mother had gone up to visit him, and I happened to be born near Edgewood Arsenal. But I was brought right back to Tennessee, and I grew up in Nashville. And then my parents moved to Alabama when I was about 18. And my ambition was to go to the University of Missouri School of Journalism, which was the only professional school of journalism in the world at that time, I think. As opposed to majoring in journalism, this was a separate professional school, like going to dentistry school or law school or something. And I went to the University of Alabama, and then I went to the University of Missouri, and then I got a job on a paper in North Carolina, and then other papers here and there. And then my husband was transferred, got a job in California with Hughes Research and Development. So we moved out there, and I started working for Copley newspapers. And while I was working what we called Cityside then, covering events in the city, I began writing fan magazine stories on the side just to make some extra money, because it was easy to do. I was working right next door to MGM, so that's how I started.
Well, I want to pull a couple of those things out that you raced through there. You went to the Peabody Demonstration School. Talk about the type of teachers you had and what they taught you there.
Oh, I went there from the first grade through the 6th grade, and then back for the 11th and 12th grades. And I will say to anybody that Peabody Demonstration School, when I was there, was probably the best grammar school in the world. You could not have gone to a better one. It was considered rather avant-garde because they used creative teaching methods. For instance, in first grade, we were each given a little wooden orange crate, and we could make a store out of our orange crate and sell anything we wanted to. We cut our merchandise out of catalogs. You know, if we were selling furniture, we cut out pictures of beds and chairs and things. And then we made money out of cardboard, little round circles, and marked at 10 cents, 5 cents, $1. And we bought and sold and made change. And that way we learned to multiply, to add and subtract and to multiply to some extent. And that's the way they taught at Peabody. It was a wonderful place. I really liked it. But my mother had gone to Ward Belmont, And she said I had to go to Ward Belmont for at least 1 year, and if I didn't like it, I could quit there. So, I said, all right, I'll go to Ward Belmont in the 7th grade. So my best friend, Ann Howe, and I went to Ward Belmont. And I stayed 4 years. I liked it pretty well, but then I said I'm going back to Peabody where the boys are, so I did.
But I believe in your education, you must have been well versed in being a lady and Southern gentility and all of the appropriate social customs and actions.
Well, everybody was that I knew. I mean, for instance, we were taught to say ma'am and sir to our elders. And Miss Annie Allison was the principal at Ward Belmont of the high school department. And I'll never forget Peggy Wren and I were coming out of Cresses on 5th Avenue one day, eating chocolate-covered peanuts, and ran into Miss Allison. And Miss Annie about had a fit. She said, I never thought I'd see any of my girls eating on the street. I mean, you did not do that.
Oh, that's
Right.
a good example of what I was talking about.
And you got demerits for not sitting up straight,
Well,
which I'm not doing now.
well, this is a casual interview. I think you
Yeah.
should be allowed to sit like you want. At the University of Alabama, you had a pleasant year there, and you were exposed to Southern gentility in a way, but you also met people that were later very famous. Coach Paul Bear Bryant at the time was a student and a football player, and you had a class or two with him. What do you remember?
Yeah, well, Bear Bryant, yes indeed. He taught our girls' gym class for about 6 weeks and taught us to hit a tackling block, a big leather block. I don't know what you call it, with your shoulder, how to block, in other words, how to do stuff like that, because he didn't know what else to do with the girls, but in gym, that is. But he was in my English class, and he sat on the front row right in front of the teacher's desk. And Bear'd come in late nearly every day, and he'd sit down and then lean over on the teacher's desk and put a piece of paper there, and he's working out football plays, I think. And he's not doing well in English. And one day he comes in and he starts this, and the teacher says, stand up, Mr. Bryant. So Bear stands up, and the teacher says, I guess you're a good football player, but a pretty good football player, but, and he starts telling him he's the worst English student he's about ever seen. And if his grades go down, he can't play football, and he'd better pay attention, shape up, and so forth. And then he said, now, have you got anything to say for yourself, Mr. Bryant? So Bear stands up, and he said, yes, sir, I do. I reckon you're right. I reckon I am a pretty good football player. That was his reaction.
That was a good response. Now, another one I thought you mentioned there was later on probably the world's greatest blind golfer, Charlie Boswell.
Oh, Charlie Boswell. He was a Senator McKay, I think, at Alabama when I was there. And I was working at the Birmingham Post when word came over the wire that he'd been blinded in World War II. And so I was asked to call his wife. Somebody asked, didn't I know her? Well, I didn't know her well, but we had been in school together. I knew her slightly. So I had to call her to see what prospects were. And at that time, she thought maybe Charlie'd get his sight back, because they told her that it seemed to be some kind of nerve damage that might be repaired. I think that's what she told me. But I don't think he ever saw again.
I don't think so, but he sure impressed the world with his ability to play
blind
golf.
golfer.
Now, not to dwell on this too much, but what about the atmosphere at the University of Alabama in the Depression? But it was a major state university, and what was it like being a student there?
Well, it had a reputation for being a good time party school. I didn't think it was any more of a good time party school than the University of Missouri, which also was a good time party school, but didn't have the reputation. Yeah, it was sort of nice in a way going to school during the Depression, because in the first place, nobody thought of burning down the administration building or something, because everyone was so afraid they wouldn't get back the next semester. Money was short, and entertainment was real innocent. If you had a date, you probably walked over to a fraternity house and you played bridge, or you played ping pong, or you danced to a record player, and that was about the extent of it. Nobody had cars much. In fact, the houseboy at the Senator McKay house had a car, and different boys would borrow the houseboy's car sometimes.
Now, the University of Missouri is well known for its prestigious journalism school. What attracted you to journalism?
Well, when I was in the 6th grade at Peabody, I've said well too much, I was editor of this grammar school paper. And then when I got back to Peabody in high school, I was co-editor of the school paper and the yearbook. And when I was in 6th grade, I told my father I thought I'd work on a newspaper. So he went to see Howard Eskridge, whose daughter was in my class at Ward Belmont, I think. I asked him, he was the editor, at the Banner, or maybe it was Tennessee, and I've forgotten where Mr. Eskridge worked. I think it was the Banner. and I asked him what I should do to get a job on a paper someday. And he suggested that I try to get into the University of Missouri School of Journalism. That in the first place, papers scouted the University of Missouri. They'd write to ask about graduates, if you got a graduate that looks sensible. And it was a good way to get a job.
Were there many women in school at the University of Missouri?
An adequate number. Now, Alabama, I believe, I was told, there were 6.5 boys to every girl when I was there. At Missouri, unfortunately, it was the other way around. They weren't all at the university, but there were 2 big girls' schools in town, Stevens College and Christian College.
Yeah, I know about
So
Stevens.
a lot of girls were in Columbia, Missouri.
Stevens College could be defined perhaps as an old-time finishing school. Would that be appropriate?
I don't know. Ward Belmont would come nearer had been so described. Stevens was very proud of its drama department, I think, because Maud Adams, who had been a very famous actress, and she'd be of my mother's or even my grandmother's generation maybe, was head of their drama department. And they were very proud of that. They were less proud of the fact that Joan Crawford had gone to school there for a while.
Joan Crawford was a wild one. Did you have
apparently so.
opportunity to interview her?
Yes, I've talked to Miss Crawford, and she was a very unusual person.
Just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to dwell a little bit more on journalism school. What did they teach you there, and what was emphasized?
Well, in the first place, you couldn't just walk in the door. You had to do so much prerequisite work. It took you a couple of years to get to the point where you could apply. You had to have so much in foreign languages, economics, history, English, of course, some psychology, various other subjects that I think are really more important than what they call journalism classes these days, because if you don't know some history and you don't know some economics and you don't know some political science, a lot of political science, you have no idea how to write a story of what you're writing about. And then when you admitted to the School of Journalism, students in the journalism school worked for a daily paper that was not owned by the university. It was the city's daily paper, and we worked for it. And then we also went to other classes. We continued our foreign languages and history and so forth.
Well, what did you find in terms of ethics? Did they teach ethics? People nowadays always are belittling the press for some reason. Seems like they're a scapegoat sometimes, but did they teach you ethics?
I can't remember that they were even discussed. I think in my day and age, people assumed people were ethical, and people generally were. Some people weren't, but I guess, probably. But it was just assumed people knew how to behave.
Well, let me ask you this. I want to pick out one other aspect of your journalism career that I thought was interesting, and that was working in Birmingham.
Ah, yes.
Now, that was a big city newspaper, at least in the South. Talk about how that paper functioned and some of the things you did there.
Well, I was just hired as a reporter, and it was great fun. I had to be at work at 5:30 or 6 in the morning or something, because we had editions that came out. And when I was just a reporter, I covered various things. And since I was such an eager beaver, I'd cover things nobody else wanted to cover at all. And I got lucky that way. I told you about the time I met Senator Bankhead, because I volunteered to go cover some kind of farm meeting they were having, and nobody wanted to go to that. It sounded so boring. So I went, and guess who was there? Senator Bankhead, Tallulah's father, who was from Washington. He'd come down. He was on the, I guess, on the Senate Agricultural Committee. And he asked me if I'd have lunch with him at the Redmont Hotel. Was that the name? There was a hotel named something like that. So we're having lunch, and while we're eating, here comes a whole delegation of cotton growers from Limestone County, Alabama, and they are furious with the way some federal program revolving about cotton was being administered. And they said they were going to load their bales on the side of the road and set fire to them before they would follow whatever the edict was from Washington. I don't remember the particulars. Well, Senator Bankhead immediately got on the phone and started calling the Secretary of Agriculture and all kind of people in Washington about how the program was being mismanaged by Washington. So the next day, there were reporters in, white people who've been covering the White House. All the big guns are in Birmingham, and I've already had one story ahead of them. And this gets people's attention. That's one reason that and a few other things like that's how I got to be the assistant city editor.
what type of work week did you have, and how much did they pay you? Do you remember the salary?
I'd say $35 a week's a pretty good guess. About 30 to 35.
And the hours just matched whatever you had to do, right?
Yeah, and I've talked to some old-time newspaper people who worked back in those days. I never joined the newspaper guild, never did. Didn't have to and didn't want to, because some of these old-timers were complaining that they had had to join the guild and it simply ruined newspaper work. They said if you're out somewhere, for instance, covering a hostage situation, and it's 30 minutes plus the time you're supposed to have quit, and you call in the city desk, say, hey, I think something's going to happen here in another couple of hours, I got to stay on. Say, no, you got to come on in, because I can't, under the union scale, I can't afford to keep you there any longer. And I never had that situation, but I didn't belong to the guild.
This undoubtedly had to be good training for what you did later on when you got to mingle with the stars. The type of work you did there gave you a good background?
I don't know that working with the Birmingham Post gave me too much of a background, except it did, for instance, show me how to talk to police reporters downtown and get them to help me, things like that. For instance, I knew a police captain from my city-side work around Los Angeles. I'd worked the city, and when there was a car parked up at Elvis's one time, and I wanted to know who was visiting him, this guy, she really shouldn't have done it, but he was a friend. I called down there and I said, John, let me give you this license number, and will you call me back and tell me whose car that is? So he did. It was handy that way.
Do you remember where you were on Pearl Harbor Day and what was happening?
Oh, yes, I was playing poker. It was during the period I was working for the Birmingham Post, and my husband and I were living in Bessemer, Alabama, and so did my parents at that point. And we'd been to church, and then we'd gone out to my parents' house to play poker with a couple who were about our age, and with my father, and with a young man who was in the Air Force who was a friend of my brother's, and we all sitting there playing poker. And somebody told me the forsythia was in bloom outside, so I walked out there to see, and when I came back in, everybody was running in circles and screaming the Japanese had just attacked Pearl Harbor. Yeah, I remember.
You've referred to your husband several times. I'd like for you to mention his name and tell us how you met him.
Oh, Ray Anderson. Well, the first job I got when I finished the University of Missouri, and I thought I'd never get one, was on a daily paper in North Carolina. Well, it took me 2 or 3 months to get one. And he had a little shop up there and bought advertising. And that's how I met him. Yeah.
And when he was assigned to work for Howard Hughes in California, that was really a change in your career too, or it opened up this opportunity to...
Well, I'd worked for the Birmingham Post. We'd moved on down to Birmingham, where he worked for my father while my husband did, not Howard Hughes. And then we'd moved to Georgia, and in Georgia I'd worked for a radio station. So I'd been working in various kinds of, news type things all this time. So when we got out to California, there was a Copley newspaper. Copley's a chain, 2 flagship papers, the San Diego Union and Tribune. But around Los Angeles they had a number of papers, and so I went to work for one of the Copley papers there, and then one thing led to another.
Well, if you were raised in the South and either lived in the border states or in the South most of your life, Hollywood was either an eye-opener or a shock. What were your early impressions in arriving in California?
Well, I hated Los Angeles when we first got there. I hated the traffic. I still don't like a lot of traffic. And I missed people I knew, of course. I had friends other places. But as far as the movies went, I don't know. It wasn't too different from working with politicians or anybody else.
Were you a movie fan before you went to Hollywood?
Oh, when I was in high school, I was. Oh, yes. And in college, my roommate in college and I used to spend our evenings trying to phone Groucho Marx. Of course, we never got through to him. When other girls were wanting to call Tyrone Power, we wanted to call Groucho. And I told him that one time. I told him I'd spent my youth trying to get him on the telephone.
Well, I wanted to spend the last part of our interview talking about some of these people, so if you don't mind,
All right.
Let me just throw some names to
Okay.
you, and you can react to those that you would like to react to. Well, I have Groucho Marx on the list. What about Groucho? What would you say about Groucho?
Well, he was nice to me. Once I was on that show he had, I've forgotten the name of it, where a duck came down, and if the duck came down, you got $300 or something.
Yeah, George Fenneman, I think, was his
Yeah,
sidekick.
and Groucho let the duck come down, so I got $300 or something. That was nice.
Oh, you were on that show?
Yeah, I was on
I
it
bet
one
I
time.
saw you on that. I used to watch that every week.
Well, anyway, Groucho, and then when Groucho had gotten kind of batty in a way, I went up to see him a few times. That's when Aaron Fleming, his lady friend, was up living with him, tending to him. And when she and the estate had such a battle over who got some of his money, I really thought she deserved it, because she made him very happy and took care of him. And of course, I could see his children's point of view too.
Well, I want to mention my favorite, Susan Hayward.
Susan Hayward, I knew her somewhat. Her twin son, she had twin sons. One's a veterinarian, I think in Virginia now or something. He went to Auburn. The other son, Tim, the Barker boys, wanted to be an actor, so she told me. But when I knew Tim, he was a publicist. And he used to hang around quite a bit. And I don't know what's become of Tim Barker. He hasn't called me lately. But, yeah, I knew him.
Well, Charlton Heston, everyone knows Charlton Heston, but I'd like for you to comment on him. But what attracts some stars to get into social issues or political issues? He's closely associated with the National Rifle Association. What is it that attracts
Same thing
somebody?
that attracts anybody else to him. I mean, somebody's interested in something. I presume he likes guns and likes to shoot. He's really a very nice, decent man. And he and his wife, Lydia, they've been married, well, ever since World War II. Got married while he was in the Army. They'd gone to college together at Northwestern. And as far as I know, their children haven't gotten in any trouble. Once I was at a party at his house and saw a photographer fall in the swimming pool, backing up to take a picture. That's the most interesting thing ever happened around Charlton Heston, as far as I know. He's a very nice man, but not anyone who is too colorful.
Most people watch the TV series, My Three Sons, so I think everybody
You Fred McMurray?
knew Fred McMurray. Any impressions there?
Yeah, again, a pleasant fellow. Supposed to be the stingiest man in the whole world. I don't know. His wife said, it was his second wife, I guess, that they really got well acquainted because he was driving her home from some event one time, and he saw her to the door, and when they got there, they saw a pipe leaking in her bathroom or kitchen or something. He said, just a minute, I always do my own plumbing, and he went out to his car and he had some tools and he came in and fixed the plumbing. And that would be typical. I mean, if he could save a buck by fixing his own plumbing, he did.
Well, I mean,
very sensible.
You're giving good little stories, insight into some of these people. Well, everybody I thought loved Doris Day.
Yeah, everybody didn't, but I liked Doris a lot. A lot of people didn't much like Doris because, like Debbie Reynolds, like a lot of them, certainly like Joan Crawford, a woman who is going to become a real big star has to be very strong-minded and forceful. And Doris didn't start out that way. She told me that before she married Marty, what's his name? Oh gosh, they got a divorce. And
Starts with an M, doesn't it?
well, Melton, Marty Melton, that he used to call her Miss Lacrimose because she sat around crying all the time because her career wasn't going the way she wanted. But I like Doris a lot. She used to ride a bicycle down to Beverly Hills, and I'd meet her sometimes in Nate and Al's Delicatessen behind my office, and we'd have some coffee and a bagel or something.
Well, she's another one that I thought picked up on social issues, the protection of animals.
Animals were her big thing, yeah.
Well, Rock Hudson, to me, was a marvelous actor. Of course, they brought out the homosexual aspect
I'm not
of his life.
sure that that aspect was as presented. I'm sure Rock may have gotten into some mischief here. That's probably because since he died of AIDS. I really think Rock almost had no sex drive at all because I liked him a lot. Nice man. He was very shy when I first knew him. He got over some of his shyness. But once you got to know him, he was funny, he was friendly, he was nice. But he grew up in difficult circumstances in a very rich town where his family had no money. He told me that he was invited to high school dances because he was the best dancer at school, but he not only didn't have a suit, he didn't even have a jacket. And he told me other stories like that. And one day we were riding onto the Universal lot in a convertible, his car, and the gateman says, "How are you, Mr. Hudson?" waves us through. Rock says, "I always expect him to slam the gate and say, 'You can't come in here.'" And I'm pretty sure when he was early in the movies, he was crazy about Vera Ellen, who was a little singing, dancing star of different pictures, and she couldn't see him for smoke. I mean, he was nobody. And he was playing Indians, that type thing. And And he lived with the woman he married for a couple of years before they got married, a year or two. Phyllis Gates, what was her name? Phyllis Gates. So I really think Rock was so shy for so long, he just didn't make much of a play for women or for anybody else.
Did you know Liberace?
Just a little bit. My husband was talking last night about the time we went to the party at his house, and Liberace showed us all around, and Ray was most impressed by the real tiger skin. It looked like a leopard skin bedspread on his bed. It was a huge thing. They must have killed a half a dozen tigers to piece that together.
Well, I think all Americans really enjoyed watching William Holden on the screen.
Nice man. I guess drinking was his downfall. But he, in fact, not terribly long before he died, I was on location with a movie he was making in Australia, and he was playing a man who had learned he was going to die. And so I said to him, if you knew you were going to die in another 2 or 3 months, what would you do? Besides try to get cured, I guess, but I mean otherwise. He said, well, first I'd be sure my financial affairs were in order. I'd get my estate settled. He said, I can't imagine dying, though, because I have so many things I want to do. Well, not long after that, he apparently drunk, fell and hit his head and bled to death.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
Well, when you're mentioning all these famous people, you have to mention Jimmy Stewart, and I've always had the impression that Jimmy Stewart was absolutely straight-laced. He was a military man.
He was a very fine man. Again, what you saw was what you got. Jimmy Stewart off screen was about like Jimmy Stewart on screen. A nice, good man, yeah.
Did you find that a lot of these people were generous with their money, donating to causes? And
a lot of them do. Particularly the ultra-liberal set donates heavily, I guess, to political campaigns. And some of them have donated a lot to other causes, but not all of that is publicized. Now, sometimes it is. The ones, though, that, in a way, I admire more, not just the ones who write big checks. If you've got the money, you can write a check. But the ones who give of their own time. For instance, my daughter, who now lives in Bell Buckle and works in Nashville, was working for one of the Copley papers, I think, right after she got out of college when she was real young. And she ran across a little boy down at Harbor General Hospital, which was some south of Los Angeles, who had some awful disease, I've forgotten what, probably going to die. And he spent all his time watching television. And his 3 favorite shows were Bonanza and Gomer Pyle and Hogan's Heroes. So my daughter said if just one of those stars would call him, it would excite him to death. So I said he lucked out. 2 of the shows have very nice stars, Michael Landon and Jim Nabors. Couldn't be nicer. Now Bob Crane may be a little more difficult. But I asked all 3 of them to call him. I think they all 3 did, and I think Mike even went down to see him. And Jim and Mike called him several times. I mean, they followed up. Now, by contrast, there was a little boy sick in the Shelbyville Hospital. Again, my daughter ran across, had cancer or something, and his big hero was David Hasselhoff. Well, wrong choice there. So I called David Hasselhoff's then publicist, who happens to be, who is its mother-in-law? Well, Clint Black's mother-in-law, and Johnny Hartman, Lisa Hartman Black's mother. And I said, could you get David Hasselhoff to call this boy? She said, yes, and he'll call a certain day, certain time. I said, now, they're going to take the child off medication at that time for a few hours so he can talk to him and he'll know he's calling, so be sure he's going to call now. He didn't call. This goes on a couple of times, and I called and I said, make that man call. So she said, well, Hasselhoff at that time had a serious romance going with a soap opera actress. She says she'll hold him up by his coat and stand him against the payphone to make him call. She'll make him call, Catherine Hicklin. So he did call, and then he did send the boy an autographed picture and something like that.
Do you think it makes much difference to Americans who movie stars endorse for governor or president?
To some people, I'm sure it does, and to some probably don't care. A handful of stars, or maybe more than a handful, take their politics seriously and are well informed. Robert Ryan and I disagreed on politics all the time, but I respected him enormously because he was well informed. It wasn't just a trendy thing. You know, he wouldn't pick a candidate because this is chic. He knew what he was doing, why he was voting that way, and I really respected his opinions, though I didn't agree with them.
Did you find situations where there was real competition among some actors, or was that just for publicity, or much of that going on?
Well, when they were under the studio contract system, they didn't have much to, they couldn't compete, they couldn't do anything. They did what they were told, and that was it. Yeah, there were a few, I don't know if it was competition, but do you remember a show, I think it was Riverboat, and Darren McGavin and Burt Reynolds were in it. This was a long time ago, TV series. And they did not get along. And Burt told me one time, he said, Darren McGavin knows every way in the world to steal a scene. Said, sure as I have a line, he'll take off his coat in front of the camera or do something. I told McGavin about this, and he said, well, I'm glad I taught him something, even if it was only how to steal a scene. So they didn't like each other.
I watched a special one time on TV about the Barrymores.
Oh, yes.
And I forgot the movie that they were all in, but they said if you'll watch these various scenes, they're all trying to steal the scene from each other.
Rasputin and the Empress.
Okay.
They were all three in that.
Yeah, and sure enough, they were all doing little things to.
Yeah, you know, if one actor has a big scene and he's saying his lines and the other one is taking off his coat, scratching his head, doing anything to get your attention away from what's happening.
Well, I know that I'm giving you a lot of names, but these are names that people recognize. Olivia de Havilland.
I knew Olivia de Havilland to some extent. She lives in Paris now, and I talked to somebody the other day who had been there and had lunch with her recently and said she's fine. You know, she married a Frenchman, and I guess I don't know whether they're still married or not, but I guess that's why she lives in Paris. Her children have French citizenship. I guess they're grown by now. But she told me that she was so stuck on Errol Flynn, they made some pictures together, as you remember, most famous of which was Robin Hood, that she would deliberately mess up their love scenes so they'd have to do them over again. And I told somebody that, and they said, oh, that's not true. He'd have done love scenes with her whether they were in a movie or not. She didn't have to do that.
Well, Errol Flynn just had a horrible reputation as a human being. I guess he was a pretty good actor. Was he dead by the time that you got to
No. No. I didn't know him, but I knew Beverly Adeline and her mother. Beverly being the first, she was 15 at first and then 16-year-old girl who was living with him at the Hollywood Knickerbocker Hotel.
I remember that.
And who'd gone with him to Canada when he died. And I took her mother to the airport to meet Beverly and Mr. Flynn's body as they flew back into Los Angeles. And I asked Florence Adeline, that being the mother, I said, Florence, don't you think Mr. Flynn is just a little old for Beverly? She said, oh, no, honey, I jerked up his shirt tail and there's not an ounce of fat on him. Said, I wish my other daughter had these opportunities.
Well, I just thought of this question. Did you ever cover Hollywood funerals? Sometimes they were big extravaganzas and...
Yeah, I went to some funerals. I didn't cover them exactly. I went because the deceased was a friend. For instance, my husband was a pallbearer when Marjorie Main died, and I got the other pallbearers. She died rather suddenly. She called me. Well, Marjorie left to go to Bible class at Pat Boone's on Tuesday night, and Ray and I'd pick her up and take her up to Bible class, and she and Arthur O'Connell would sit together. And night after we'd been to Bible class, I knew Marjorie wasn't well. She was in the 80s, and she had a bad heart. But she called our house. I was at the grocery, and when I got back, Ray said Marjorie called and that she was going to the hospital for some tests, but don't call her there, come to see her, because when you're in the hospital, she just doesn't want to be bothered. So I said, all right, and about 2 days later, she was dead. Turned out she had cancer. She was eaten up with it. So we went out to the funeral home at Forest Lawn, and I overheard somebody say that she was going to have professional pallbearers. And I said to Ray, I said, that's horrible. A woman who has worked around this industry so long and been in this town so long, to have a bunch of hired strangers take her to the grave. That night my phone rang, and somebody there had heard me say that and had called her lawyer or her banker, I don't know which, who was calling me to say I'd been overheard. Did I know anybody who would be suitable to be a pallbearer? I said, yeah. He said, well, would I get the pallbearer? So I did. And I got Dean Jones. I got a high school principal that Marjorie liked a whole lot. I got a fellow, Speck McClure, who'd been Louella Parsons' leg man. I believe it was Louella's. No, it wasn't. It might have been Hedda's. Anyway, and Marjorie thought the world of him. I asked Pat Boone, Marjorie liked him a lot, if he could be a pallbearer, but he was out of town singing the national anthem at a baseball game or something. And I've forgotten who else.
Well, you said that you were overheard. That reminds me of something else. At parties or events, did you ever overhear conversations that would give you a lead on a story or a possible interview?
Well, I didn't overhear them, but often somebody would tell me something they'd heard. For instance, I first got word that Frank Sinatra was courting Mia Farrow when a still photographer, photographers are great sources because people forget the photographer was there. Sometimes, I mean, go about their business and pay no attention. Anyway, this fellow was the still photographer on Von Ryan's Express, a movie starring Frank Sinatra. And he called me one day in great excitement. He said, Mia Farrow came over the set today to see John Layton. He was another actor and an English actor she knew. And he said, I said, Frank Sinatra asked to be introduced, and said he zeroed in. And he said, he really means business, I think. And then later this photographer called me and said Frank had given Mia a compact with a sentimental message engraved in it, and Mia had shown it to the photographer, who promptly told me about it.
You have an impression of Frank Sinatra?
I don't think I met him, talked to him, went to a party he gave once, but I don't think I would have liked him particularly, though he had his good points. In some ways, like the typical movie gangster or something, might have your leg broken, but on the other hand could do something very generous for you. He, not for me, I'm talking about other people. A friend of mine, an actress, had a husband who tended to beat her up. He was an actor, and she dated Sinatra some. I said, tell Frank Sinatra, he'll put a stop to that you won't get hit again, I don't think.
I would like to mention a few more. One of the smoothest people ever to grace the screen would be David Nevin.
I met David Nevin, interviewed David Nevin. Very witty, very charming, and what more can I say?
Very sophisticated, you would say? Or
oh, I'm sure by sophisticated it comes from the Greek word that means knowledgeable, you know, yeah.
Well, he seemed like he was very versatile on the screen and could play those type of role. Now, a person that I want to mention that only a few of our viewers would be familiar with, unless they read the credits on the movies, and that would be Edith Head.
Edith Head, oh, surely. Well, she was a great fashion designer, and I knew her, and what can I tell you? That's it.
Well, I mean, how would a person like that last so long in movies? Was she really talented?
Oh, yeah, she was talented. She was talented, and she not only knew what would suit a scene, she knew what would suit an actress, and actresses like to wear her clothes because it made the most of their assets.
We mentioned Ronald Reagan. Did you know Jane Wyman?
Yes, I've known Jane Wyman for some time, yeah, really.
You think she missed out on being First Lady, or is she glad that marriage dissolved?
Well, I heard that while they were still married, I wasn't in Hollywood then, I was in Birmingham, I guess, that she was so mean to him, you know, they met making Brother Rat, that her star was rising faster than his, and that she realized it. But she told this friend of mine, the same one that met the naked Robert Mitchum, that said all Ronnie wants to do ever is talk politics. That's when he was a liberal Democrat, and also then I suppose when he was president of Screen Actors Guild and was fighting the communist takeover in Hollywood.
Well, I've got 2 or 3 other names here, and then we'll stop. What about the death of Marilyn Monroe? A lot of speculation on that. Were you in Hollywood at the time that happened?
Yes. Well, there's still a lot of speculation on it, and my personal view is she might have been killed some way by organized crime, because there's no telling what kind of pillow talk she and the Kennedys carried on, and she may have known a few things that they didn't want out, but as I told you, I still can't remember the man's name. I knew a writer who claimed to have been married to her, and I believe he really was. And they stayed married one day and got it annulled, but I believe he really was, because I checked that out with somebody else who was there who would have no reason to lie. But he said the week before she died, she called him and said she was talking from a payphone, and she wanted to talk to him, and she didn't want to call use the phone at the house because it was bugged, which it was. And could he pick up the payphone and they'd talk in his car, because there's no way the conversation could be taped there. So he picked her up and he said they rode out to Malibu, and she told him that she had given the Kennedys an ultimatum that she was going to have a press conference the next week and tell all. What all she was going to tell is all, I don't know. But he's told us that you shouldn't do that, you know, that's dangerous. You ought not to do a thing like that. And the next week she died, and he felt that someone had contributed to her death. I don't know.
We've just got a couple of minutes left. A couple of quick comments. How could such a gifted actor like Marlon Brando turn into such a slob?
I don't know. I spent only one day with Marlon Brando, and that was in court. He and his first and maybe only legal wife, Anna Cashby, a good friend of mine, were going through their ongoing court battles that went on, divorce, custody, everything else. And I went with Anna to court and wound up sitting with Marlon.
And the last one, a quick comment. Walt Disney had a tremendous impact on American entertainment.
Yes, he did. And I liked Walt Disney, and I'll say this ere we wind up. I don't think Disney World is what he planned. I had lunch with him one day. He'd been sick, and everybody knew he'd been sick. But he said, I want you to come up to my office now. I want to show you something I'm planning. And I went up there, and he showed me plans for something to be called Disney World he was going to build in Florida. And it was going to be the ideal community under a glass, a plexiglass or something dome, where you'd have controlled climate, and it would never, like Camelot, it would never rain till after sundown or whatever. And he would have an entertainment area, but it was going to be a place where people lived. And he died before he went any further with that. Well, I have a lot of pictures with celebrities. I didn't ask to have them taken, but photographers would just snap them. But I didn't put them any on the wall except some that have some special significance. Somebody brought me this picture of John Wayne when he was very young, as you see, just before I left Los Angeles to move here. And he wrote on it, Dear Nancy, when you and I were 17, at least you were, I mean, at least I was, you weren't born then, love Duke. So I treasure that because he was a good friend and I thought the world of him. There he was, some older. And there's Cary Grant that nobody ever recognizes. We were at a dinosaur tennis tournament in Palm Springs, and we were just chatting, and a Chinese photographer I knew took our picture and gave me a copy, Stephen Queen. And this picture of Elvis, over here, I have a couple of them on the wall of Elvis. The one at the top was the night he opened at Las Vegas when he went back into live performances after not having done them for a long time after his movie career. And there's Colonel Park on the background. And down here we're standing on the stage of what was it, where he played twins. I've forgotten the name of it. And I know exactly why he's clutching his brow. Somebody had told me that he'd given Anne Margaret a round pink bed. So I said to him, why'd you give Anne Margaret a round pink bed? He said, I didn't give her a round pink bed. I said, who told you that? And I said, Anne Margaret. Well, that kind of left him up a creek, so that's why he's clutching his brow. And there's other people here, but we won't talk about all of them. And over here, more political types. A letter from J. Edgar Hoover thanking me for a story I wrote one time. And Jean-Claude Duvalier, Baby Doc, who was president of Haiti. And he's gotten very bad press. People think of the whole Duvalier family as a bunch of tyrants, and perhaps they were to an extent, but better than most of the presidents of Haiti. And I really like Baby Doc. I was invited down to interview him by a French-Canadian photographer I knew, and then Ms. Roosevelt and Imelda Marcos. That was taken on the Marcos yacht. I was at the Manila Film Festival, and about 2 in the morning I got a call from the palace asking if I'd like to go out with Mrs. Marcos for a day on the yacht. So naturally I said yes, and that's what we did. And we went over to Bataan and looked at what was left of the war. And then we went to the Marcos vacation home. I guess they answered to Camp David, and she personally cooked lunch. It was very nice.
Ms. Anderson, you've really shared a lot of great experiences with us, and these pictures are just marvelous, and I'm delighted that you could share with our viewers your experiences with all the famous people that you've known, and I want to thank you so much and wish you continued good luck in retirement, and hope you have a pleasant and long life here in this beautiful little town down in Bell Buckle.
Well, thank you very much.